DRWolf Daycare, written by DRWolf, and based on an art piece originally drawn by Bliss. Chapter 3. Dr. Wolf gave a small sigh. Originally, he'd headed over to the cafe's kitchen to make himself some tea in hopes of relaxing a little bit and to check on Firebrand, who was still in timeout in the oven. But children being children, his aged-down friends had other ideas, namely some stomach growls and desires for snacks. And naturally, it wasn't as easy as going to get the snacks and bringing them back, as the foals couldn't talk well. As a result, he decided letting them pick while his lady waited behind in case Silverquill came back while they were gone made the most sense. He hoped. Again, his experience in this category was rather lacking. Naturally, a wolf puppy had completely different needs than ponies. The cafe was thankfully well stocked and had plenty of options for preparing food. In fact, the oven currently housing Firebrand was not the only one, given the sheer number and variety of people who would use it. Not only did different ponies have different tastes, different species did as well. So some rather exotic things could be found here. Finding something for 5 foals shouldn't be that difficult. Shouldn't and wouldn't were unfortunately very different words. The doc carefully opened the oven and peeked in. "Firebrand, are you doing all right in there?" he asked, then jumped back as a small blast of fire magic hit the door. "I'll take that as a no." As the anthropomorphic wolf was checking on the fiery colt, little Toon gave a bored sigh, looking around. It was then the literal cult of personality's eyes fell on the still open door and a mischievous grin formed on his muzzle. Now, Mr. Firebrand, if you want to get out of timeout, you need to behave yourself," Dr. Wolf said, trying to sound stern as he closed the oven up again. He gave a sigh. He honestly wished the little colt hadn't been part of this mess. Firebrand did know how to be stern and would probably be helpful keeping this situation in hoof. The psychiatrist turned back to the other foals and gave a small smile, watching them waiting as patiently as they could given their age. Which wasn't much, but better than he'd expected. "All right. Now, shall we find a snack for you all?" He couldn't help giving a chuckle at the cheering that earned from the excited foals. He decided to try and enjoy it, given this was probably the most calm this situation had been the entire time, and he had no idea how long that would last. Firebrand pushed open the oven door and looked over. "Snack? If you behave yourself in there, then maybe you can have one," Doc replied, looking to the tiny unicorn, and making sure he knew where the fire extinguisher was. KP looked a little Firebrand and stuck her tongue out. Firebrand gave a glare and retreated back into the oven, allowing the door to slam shut with a loud bang. "Now, let's see what we have," Dr. Wolf said, walking over to the fridge and opening it, and then realized about half of it was over his head. "I believe I'll need a stepladder. Regardless, do you 5 see anything you would want?" he questioned, then realized something. Wait. Lightning Bliss, Golden Fox, Keyframe, KP, and... Doc's eyes went wide. "Where's Toon?" The 4 foals blinked, looking at each other and then around. "Toon?" Dr. Wolf asked, looking around in panic. He checked around the furniture but found no sign of the red and black colt, then saw the open door, and his heart skipped a beat. Oh no. He dashed to the door and then stopped, looking back. The kitchen was prepared when they'd put Firebrand in timeout, so it was fairly safe. And how far could Toon have gotten? "Please, stay here. I need to get Lady and find Toon." The rift was a huge place. If they didn't find him quickly, there was no telling what might happen. And while his sense of smell was as good as ever, he admitted his much younger lady was more in touch with their species' tracking instincts than he was, and he would need her. The four foals blinked innocently as Dr. Wolf closed the door so they too couldn't get out. Golden Fox and Keyframe went to playing with each other while KP seemed to be wondering how she could continue taunting Firebrand when he was currently inside an oven. Lightning Bliss, however, gave a pout, her little stomach growling. She wanted treats. That was what Doc had said, right? And she didn't even have Toon to play with while they waited. The tiny alicorn's eyes searched the room. There had to be something she could snack on in the meantime. Her eyes went wide and seemed to sparkle when they fell on something. Atop the fridge was a brown jar with a very recognizable symbol on the side. "Cookies!" she cried, spreading her tiny little wings and trying to fly up, only to fall back on her flank. She repeated this several times, but her muscles weren't wanting to cooperate. She growled and focused, her horns sparking for a moment, then dying out. She repeated this a few times, until she finally vanished in a flash of light. Golden and Keyframe blinked as the little alicorn reappeared right in front of them, and also upside down. Little Bliss growled and tried again, reappearing on top of a fortunately closed trash can. She gave a frustrated snarl and teleported again, and fell into the sink with a splash. "Stupid horn!" the little alicorn growled, climbing out and shaking the water from her fur. In the process, her hoof turned on the faucet full blast. She trotted back up to the refrigerator, determined to get those sugary sweets. Lightning Bliss looked at a nearby cabinet. The others watched as she began scaling the cabinet to get higher so she could reach the easier-to-climb parts of the fridge. Bliss looked at the cookie jar, which seemed as though it might as well have been on top of a mountain compared to her small stature. Mountain climbing. That gave the folified analyst an idea. She let her mind wander and imagine an adventure in her mind's eye. Lightning Bliss, geared up in mountain climbing equipment and heavy coats, reached up and grabbed the next precarious rock formation, gripping on for dear life as the icy wind blew into her fur. She nearly slipped and fell, but barely hung on, looking down at the ground below. Giving a gulp, she regained her footing and pulled herself up, finally reaching a cliff face. The alicorn looked up, finding no good grips directly above her, but one grip that could lead to the top a good bit to the right. Building up her resolve, she got into a running stance before taking off and leaping, managing to latch a hoof onto the exposed hoof hold. The wind decided to pick up and bombarded her with harsh wind and chilling ice, nearly knocking her off. She had one chance and swung herself back around, landing on a more stable but slippery hoof hold. Lightning Bliss had leapt through the air, grabbing the freezer door. Unfortunately, it had swung open, nearly throwing the filly, knocking over several items on the nearby counter in the process, until she managed to get inside the freezer itself. Lightning Bliss gave a sigh of relief and carefully continued climbing, higher and higher until the peak was in sight. The ledge above her was difficult to reach, but with some death-defying stretching and movement, the alicorn managed to get her hooves on it and pull her up to the peak. She gazed upon the golden idol waiting for her at the top. The tiny alicorn gave an excited gasp and rushed to the cookie jar, grabbing it in her rainbow-colored telekinesis and pulling the lid off, knocking off the odds and ends that various analysts had placed on top of the appliance for safekeeping. "Cookies!" she cheered, stuffing her muzzle into the jar to dig in and find nothing to bite into but air. Huh? Pulling back, she looked inside and found it as empty as an abyss. Not even any crumbs. The tiny alicorn pouted, her eyes tearing up. The other fullified analyst jumped as the alicorn started crying rather loudly from her perch atop the refrigerator. Keyframe frowned and trotted over, Golden Fox joining her. "Blissy?" "No cookies!" wailed the little alicorn, showing the empty cookie jar. "No cookies?" asked KP, pouting now as well, though not crying like the tiny alicorn. Keyframe frowned, looking up at Lightning Bliss. Her friend had worked so hard to get up there, and got nothing for it. The abnormally tall filly looked around the room and saw a whisk and a few other utensils. A little light bulb went up next to her head. "Make cookies!" Lightning Bliss blinked, looking down. "Make cookies? Make cookies! Make cookies!" The four foals jumped up and down shouting "cookies" for a few moments, until Lightning Bliss processed where she was and tried to get down safely for a few moments. Little Golden Fox put a hoof to his chin, then looked at Keyframe's long legs. "Key!" "Goldie?" the abnormally tall filly asked, looking to him. The little colt pointed from himself to her back, and then to KP to his back. Lightning Bliss blinked, watching Golden Fox carefully climb up on Keyframe's back. Then both him and the unicorn to grunt as KP scrambled up them onto Golden's back. The blue Pegasus filly motioned for Lightning Bliss to climb over. "Hurry, Blissy!" shouted Keyframe, legs shaking from the weight of the other two on top of her. While Pegasi were lighter, she wasn't an earth pony. The tiny alicorn carefully climbed over onto KP's back, trying to keep balanced. "Ah!" Trying being the key word. Oof! After the pile of foals managed to untangle and separate, then came finding out how to bake cookies. Keyframe grunted as the tiny filly pushed a cookbook found from one of the drawers, along with a chef's hat that was far too large for her, but she wore it anyway, while Golden Fox pushed a stool over to sit on. "Goldie! Bowl! KP! Eggs!" Golden Fox trotted over to one of the cabinets and began pulling out pots and pans until he'd emptied it without finding what he was actually looking for. KP trotted over to the fridge and climbed up, accidentally knocking various foods and beverages onto the floor as she headed for the eggs. "Blissy, flour!" Lightning Bliss cocked her head innocently and looked around the room, then gasped and ran off. Golden Fox had emptied 2 cabinets before he finally found bowls and grabbed one in his mouth. KP finally found the eggs and held them up over her head with both hooves, a familiar little jingle from a certain video game playing, at least in her head. Keyframe nuzzled Golden as the little Pegasus put the bowl up and directed him towards the next necessary item, then took the eggs from KP to add in. "Flour?" Blissy asked, looking up at Keyframe with a potted plant with a flower in it on her head. The abnormally tall filly giggled and shook her head. "No, Blissy, flour," she said, nudging the book over and showing her the illustration. "Oh," Lightning Bliss said, putting the flour down in the middle of the floor and going looking, not noticing the sink had begun overflowing. She stacked up some of the many pots and pans Golden had left scattered all over to climb up to the top of the cabinets. She jumped up, knocking open one of the higher wall-mounted cabinets, grabbing on and struggling to peek inside, only finding a bunch of cans, many of which her hooves had knocked over and sent falling to the kitchen floor. She sighed and repeated the process a few times, including adding more destruction and clutter to the floor, until finally the familiar-looking shaped bag came into view. She gave an excited gasp and reached out, grabbing it and falling back to the top of the cabinet with an oof, and dumping some of the flour on herself in the process, leaving her normally multicolored mane now matching her coat. The foals continued this process, gaining ingredients, and innocently making more and more of a mess of the kitchen by the second. Until finally, the bowl of cookie dough looked ready, and the foals just stared at it in confusion. "What do we do?" Golden Fox asked, blinking and looking to the others. Keyframe looked at the book. "Bake." "Bake? Bake. I do." The group blinked, turning to see Firebrand having gotten his way out of the oven in all the destruction. The little unicorn colt jumped up onto the counter. "Firebutt, not good idea," KP said, backing up. The little colt growled and charged up his horn. The other foals took KP's lead and backed up. A few seconds later, a massive explosion of untrained unicorn fire magic went off and filled the room with smoke, leaving the foals coughing. "Thank you for helping me, my lady," Dr. Wolf said, finally opening the door as the smoke cleared. Lady Wolf was currently carrying Toon, who had found his way quite far in the short time since his escape and them tracking him down, and caused quite a bit of trouble playing pranks on various analysts. "Now, how about those snacks?" The two anthropomorphic wolves stared wide-eyed at the room, or rather, what was left of it. The sink had overflowed and half the floor was now flooded. Pots, pans, and many other items scattered all over the floor. Food and drinks lay in various states of damage or destruction all over the room. One of the containers had been blown up and was on fire, and a fine layer of soot and cookie dough covered everything. The foals merely sat in the middle of the room, likewise covered in dough and soot. KP, Golden Fox, and Keyframe were currently glaring at a pouting Firebrand while Lightning Bliss sat nearby, innocently eating cookie dough. "Cookies!" the tiny alicorn exclaimed. The other foals then noticed the doctor and all scrambled to hide except Bliss, who was too busy enjoying her cookie dough, and Golden Fox, who didn't notice in time. Oh dear," Dr. Wolf muttered, taking a step back as Toon just started laughing. Golden Fox looked up at the doctor, then at the mess, and realized they were in trouble, causing him to start crying. "My word! How did this happen?" KP and Firebrand poked out of hiding, and both pointed at each other accusingly. "How did what happen, Doc?" Doc turned to find himself looking at a pair of changelings. The larger of the two was dressed in orange while his smaller cohort was wearing blue. "Oh, Sketchy, it's good to see you. There's been a bit of a mishap." Sketchy blinked and looked over the pair of small anthropomorphic wolves to find the folified analyst-induced chaos. "Mishap is putting it lightly. Can you please lend me a hoof? I'm afraid this is getting a little out of mine." "Sorry, Doc. I've got some videos I need to make and a date to get to. I don't have time for this. Not to mention I'm still dealing with one headache already," the changeling replied, glaring at his younger cousin Kevin, who had wandered over to look at the foals. "Hey, where did these cute foals come from?" the ignorant changeling questioned, looking at Bliss. The tiny alicorn's head snapped up, eyes narrowing in a glare. Mr. Kevin, please don't say that word again," Dr. Wolf pleaded, seeing the look on Lightning Bliss's face. "Cute?" Kevin asked, looking back with a blink, causing Bliss to snort hot air out of her nose and magic to start building up in her horn. "But Sketchy said I just couldn't say cute around Lightning Bliss." "That is Lightning Bliss," Doc informed. Sketchy's eyes went wide. He hadn't noticed it due to Bliss's normally unmissable rainbow mane covered in soot and flour, and her being full-sized. Uh-oh. This cute little filly is Lightning Bliss? Kevin questioned, looking back down at her. Why are her eyes glowing like that? Doc, me and Kevin have to go. Good luck with this. Come on, Kevin, Sketchy called, grabbing his cousin and fleeing. Wait, Dr. Wolf called, then turned back to the ticking time bomb of a filly. Now, Miss Bliss, I know you're not fond of that word, but you need to calm down. Now, Firebrand, please behave yourself, Dr. Wolf pleaded, trying to get Firebrand into a bathtub with the other foals. No bath! The fiery foal exclaimed, squirming against the wolf's grasp until he was finally in the water, which thankfully the foalified commander didn't remember the proper spells to prevent from shorting out his magic, resulting in him simply pouting, then growling and getting into a splash fight with KP when the little filly drenched him with water. Dr. Wolf was thankful out of those present, only he, Firebrand, and Toon actually wore any clothes to begin with, and none of those for more than just personal taste. Otherwise, washing his friends off from that explosion would be far more awkward and humiliating. Lightning Bliss giggled, seeming determined to pop every single bubble in the tub. Well, at least you're enjoying yourself, Miss Bliss, Dr. Wolf said with a tired smile. He'd taken his suit off so that getting wet wouldn't cause more problems. His soaked fur was bad enough as it was. Golden Fox's ears were pinned back as he was looking down into the bathwater. Keyframe gave a whimper and nuzzled him. Sorry. It's all right, Golden Fox. Silver Quill still owes me money for office damages, Dr. Wolf assured. He knew Golden Fox would be exceptionally hard on himself when he realized he'd made a mistake, so this reaction was hardly surprising. Honestly, I'd be more worried if you didn't feel anything about this. Though Dr. Wolf would admit, Lightning Bliss's outburst combined with the other damages they'd caused would take a good bit of time to fix. But with everything that happened in the rift on a regular basis, that was essentially business as usual. While the other folified analysts were being bathed by the wolves, Toon sat nearby laughing at the situation. Until Lightning Bliss filled her mouth with water and spat it in his face, causing all 5 other foals to start laughing as the water made his signature top hat droop over his face. Not funny. Dr. Wolf gave a small sigh, but managed a little smile watching the foals be happy.